introductions are always kind of iffy. They can be a little boring, really. And so I asked the panelists that I was going to be introducing a couple of extra questions. I asked them in one sentence to tell me their favorite thing about their job. I asked them in one or two sentences to tell me about an experience when you were younger that made you decide to do what you do today. I asked them to tell me their favorite experience or memory on the Cape Fear Basin. And I asked them what their walk-up song would be if we were playing walk-up songs. So I'm going to start with the standard introduction, and then we'll see what we can get into with some of these questions. Hannah Nelson is an associate attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. She works in SCLC's Chapel Hill office with a focus on water and coastal issues. In her work, Hannah litigates cases involving industrial chemical pollution like PFAS. Hannah also works to protect the North Carolina coast, including advocating for responsible decision-making in the face of climate change. As an attorney with SCLC, Hannah represents nonprofit environmental organizations in state and federal court, ensuring that industries and government officials comply with environmental laws, including the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, and others. Hannah received her undergraduate and law degrees at UNC Chapel Hill. Now, her favorite part about her job, hands down, she said, is being an environmental attorney is working with and learning from advocates who provide a daily source of motivation to push our legal system to protect our communities and environment. I asked her about her experience that made her decide to do what she does, and she said when she was an undergrad, she took a journalism class where she learned about this thing called coal ash. We learned about coal ash here too, and how it was contaminating drinking water across our state. I was infuriated that companies and our government leaders had put so many people at risk unnecessarily. So I decided in that moment, in that classroom, that I'd go to law school and help protect my neighbors from industrial pollution. It's PFAS now, not coal ash, but you get the picture. And then her favorite experience in the Cape Fear Basin, she said, because I don't live as close to the river as some folks, I'll default to something that I've noticed through work. When you travel down any water body in the Cape Fear Basin with people who live near it or work to protect it, you can't help but feel how much joy it provides. It's almost like they are introducing you to a close friend of theirs. And when you walk away for the day, you feel like you have a new friend too. Those moments of traveling through the river system with our partners have really stuck out to me as some of my favorite memories. And I don't know if this was intentional, but Hannah chose not to choose a walk-up song. So we'll just have to, maybe we'll leave that up to her. Maybe you can talk about that at lunch. But welcome, Hannah. Thanks for coming.
It was intentional.
That's it.
Just advance that way. Awesome. Yeah, choosing a walk-up song that's both like fun and professional is really stressful, especially when he springs it on you a couple days in advance. But we can probably, y'all can help me come up with one later. All right. So good morning. My name is Hannah Nelson, and like Kemp said, I'm an attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. And I'm here today to talk to you about a proposal to expand Wilmington Harbor. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about the Southern Environmental Law Center and a little bit about me. So SCLC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan legal advocacy organization. And like Kemp said, what that means is we get to represent nonprofit groups in both state and federal court and work with them on a myriad of policy issues at the local, state, and federal level. And for me, that's awesome because we get to work right alongside some of the nation's fiercest advocates, like the folks here at Cape Fear River Watch and a lot of others here in the audience today. I joined SCLC in 2020, which was a fabulous time to start my legal career. And I work primarily on our water and our coastal teams. So a lot of my time is spent doing Clean Water Act litigation, like Kemp mentioned, involving PFAS and other industrial toxins. You're gonna hear a lot about that later today, so I'm gonna save it for the experts, and I'm excited to learn a lot with you. But the coastal side of things is what brings me here today. I work with our coastal team engaging with state and federal projects, trying to make them environmentally more responsible and to inform and help ensure that all of our decision makers are making rational and responsible decisions, particularly in the face of climate change. And so that side of my brain, that coastal side, is what brings me here today. And today, I'm going to give you an overview of a proposal to expand Wilmington Harbor. During this presentation, I'll give you that quick overview and then talk through some of the likely changes, like our changing water, our changing sand, and changing community. But because we know that massive projects like port expansions don't happen in a vacuum, I'm going to use this project as a lens to discuss other environmental challenges that we're already facing here, and how those challenges will interplay with the likely effects of the proposed expansion and how they could at times exacerbate those environmental impacts. So first, a quick overview of the proposed expansion. In 2019, the North Carolina State Ports Authority formally proposed to widen and deepen the harbor to accommodate larger container ships. And as proposed, the project would deepen portions of the harbor from 42 to 47 feet. It would widen it throughout the channel at times as great as 300 feet, and it would extend the entrance to the port further offshore. So this project would take place not only in the port where we can see it downtown, but all the way throughout the river basin down to the Atlantic Ocean. And as it stands, the Ports Authority estimates that it would take about 3 years for this project to be complete once it can start. But as I mentioned, this project was first proposed in 2019, and it's kind of been hanging out ever since. A lot has changed since then, and a lot continues to change each and every day. And there's still many steps that need to be taken before this project can move forward. One of those steps is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers needs to complete an environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. And what that means is that the agency needs to look at the likely impacts of and alternatives to this project. And they need to involve members of the public, like you and like me, in that process. Right now, the Army Corps of Engineers estimates that environmental review will be ongoing for approximately 4 years. And this presentation is actually perfectly timed because the environmental review kicked off just this week. I'm going to give a little bit more details about this at the end, but on Tuesday, the Army Corps announced that it was going to start accepting public comments on what we think, the members of the community and scientific experts think, the agency should be focusing on as it approaches this environmental review. So now is really the perfect time to start thinking through the tough questions associated with this project. And it's important that we spend comprehensive time evaluating the environmental impact of this proposal and how those impacts will play out with our daily lives here. So, without further ado, let's jump into some of those impacts. One of the biggest impacts associated with deepening and widening the harbor will be changes to the tidal range and the salinity of the Cape Fear. So the expansion itself, regardless of any sort of outside pressure, is expected to increase the mean high water level throughout the channel, with some of the highest rate increase down here in downtown. In addition, and all of that will happen because of the reduced friction and increased hydraulic efficiency that comes with making our river wider and deeper. In addition to raising that mean high water level, deepening of the entrance will cause salt water from the Atlantic Ocean to move further and further upstream. And it'll move upstream in ways that will interfere with the natural balance of the saltwater and freshwater ecosystems that Kemp was talking about. So we expect to see this increased salinity or increased salty water throughout the river system, not just in the main stem and the part that we think about as the port, but also through portions of the river like the Northeast Cape Fear, Smith Creek, Sturgeon Creek, Town Creek, Lilliput Creek, among many others. And that increased salinity is worrisome for a variety of reasons. Salt water moving up the river could detrimentally impact or completely destroy wetlands upstream. And as a result of the changed water quality, the plants and the animals that call those wetlands home will either have to migrate to suitable conditions or will cease to exist in the area. And some species, like the trees that you can see there and that y'all are probably familiar with in this area, they don't have the option of moving. So plants that have adapted to living in freshwater systems will not survive in increasingly salty water. The Cape Fear River, because of its unique balance of these saltwater, brackish, and freshwater ecosystems, is one of the most special and biodiverse rivers in the entire country. And this balance that makes it so special could be thrown off by this increase in salinity. Alongside the biodiversity loss that could occur, we also lose a powerful natural buffer to that inland flooding that Kemp mentioned when we lose our wetlands that protect our on-land life here. So I promised that I would use this project as a lens to discuss other environmental challenges that we're already facing here. So here's where I'm going to back out just a little bit. And looking outside this project, we know that sea levels are already rising. And we know that with those rising water levels, our river is already expected to change. So NOAA estimates that over the next 3 decades, sea levels on the East Coast could rise between an average of 14 to 18 inches. And so I've taken some screen grabs with my highly technical screenshot tool to kind of illustrate this. So here's where what our harbor looks like today. By 2050, NOAA anticipates sea levels in this area specifically to rise between 10 and 18 inches. So you can see the influx of the water there. By 2100, however, those projections skyrocket to between 17 and 79 inches. And if your brain can't think in terms of inches that high, like mine can't, and if you're trying to Google it now, I'll save you the time, 79 inches means 6.5 feet. So with those rising sea levels, we're already expecting to see some of the impacts that I talked about earlier. The wetland loss that could come with increased salinity could also come with these rising tides. So on this slide, I've got a map, and on the top shows what our upstream wetlands and our river system look like today, and the bottom shows what would happen under 3 feet of sea level rise. And in the circled area, you can see that the wetlands are just completely inundated with water. And so all of the projections, the ones in NOAA's screen grabs and the tools that I have pulled up here, are what could happen based on the harbor's dimensions today. And if all of this loss can be expected under the current dimensions, what happens if the tides rise with a deeper and wider harbor? Could sea levels rise faster? Would the salinity travel further than anticipated? The big takeaway here is that before embarking on major projects like this, we need to look comprehensively at the climate shifts that are already happening. And we need to ask ourselves how our decisions can impact and make our community more resilient in the face of those climate shifts, or how they will exacerbate the problem. So of course, that's changing water. And now we're going to talk about changing sand. And I had to throw up a cute little critter because why not? One of the next biggest impacts that we can expect from major port expansions like this is that it will require the movement of massive amounts of sand or sediment. And when I refer to sand and sediment here, I'm talking about the sand that's on the floor of the river. And this project will require us to dig up millions of cubic yards of that sand and sediment and dump it elsewhere. So this initial deepening, this initial digging will destroy nearly 1,000 acres of what's called soft bottom habitat that currently exists throughout the river system. And it will turn that present habitat into deep water habitat, transforming the area or the purpose that sand and sediment can be used for. And that's an issue because the habitat that's previously there has present value. For example, many of the acres that will be dug up and disposed elsewhere are currently designated as primary nursery area. And that means that it gives young fish protection, foraging opportunities, and the environmental conditions suitable for growth. And if we dig all of that up, it can no longer be suitable for those young fish. The bottom level of sand and sediment is also important for our threatened and endangered sea turtles. The Cape Fear River, the sea turtles use the Cape Fear River for a variety of reasons at a couple different life stages. Loggerheads, for example, come into the harbor as they're approaching our nearby beaches to nest, or as they're resting in between one of their multiple nesting events. And so they come in and they lay on the floor of the harbor to rest and to rehabilitate and to regrow some of their egg clutches. Juvenile green sea turtles, on the other hand, like to forage in our inshore waters, and they'll rest as they're preparing for their big adventures upstream. And so digging up all of this sand and sediment could harm these critters during the initial construction phase. But we also know that following initial construction, the sand and the sediment in the area will continue to move. And it can move even more if we make our harbor bigger. Bigger ships come with bigger wakes, and with that, the rate of erosion that we see on our shorelines could increase. And that more frequent erosion can have a couple different effects. It can increase turbidity in the water, which can threaten our recreational use of the river, as well as impact our fish, particularly the young fish that need pristine water quality in order to grow. For Wilmington specifically, we know that this sand and sediment could also be laden with toxic forever chemicals like PFAS. And like I said, you're going to hear a lot about that later, but I do just want to put in a plug that we could have water quality concerns that extend beyond just this turbidity. The more frequent and more extensive erosion can also mean more frequent and more extensive maintenance dredging. And so here's where I plan to back out just a little bit to talk about something else that's already happening here in Wilmington. Maintenance dredging are the act of coming in and digging up all of the sand that erodes into our shorelines in order to maintain the authorized depth of our harbor. It already happens here in the Cape Fear. Y'all are probably familiar with seeing some of these dredges throughout the river system. And it happens really frequently. Recently, it's had to happen every year. And most of the big, extensive maintenance dredging that goes on throughout our port in order to maintain that depth is done by what are called hopper dredges. And these are really big vessels that operate essentially like vacuum cleaners. And they have massive pipes that suck up all of the sand and sediment, and unfortunately can suck up anything else that's in their way. And these hopper dredges have negative impacts in a couple different ways. First, they can cause increased turbidity. And the best way that I can think to describe this, if anybody has a large, fluffy dog at home and you go to vacuum, you know that vacuuming stirs up the area in which you're trying to clean. And while your carpet might be perfectly pristine at the end, you walk away feeling really congested and kind of like a little hairy. I promise I love my dog. But that same thing happens here when we use hopper dredges. It stirs up all of the sand and sediment around that dredge, and that sand and sediment remains in the water and can impact our fish. Perhaps more devastating, however, is that these suction pipes are so large and so powerful that they can suck up fish, including really large fish, like endangered Atlantic sturgeon, and they can suck up sea turtles too. And the critters that are sucked into these hopper dredges are usually crushed and killed. And for the ones that can survive, our sea turtles specifically that can survive, they can suffer long-term health consequences and can even lose their egg clutches. I've focused a lot about our critters that are in the water, but it's also possible that this increased rate of erosion and our maintenance dredging practices can impact on-land animals too. Our shorebirds could lose habitat as their habitat erodes into the water. And depending on where we put the sand and sediment that is pumped up during our maintenance dredging events, it can either benefit or harm our shorebird species. So I mentioned that the Cape Fear River already has to be dredged annually to maintain the depth that we have today. And the Army Corps, in order to do these things, contracts with large national dredge companies in order to complete this dredging. And historically, those dredge companies had to use hopper dredges during the winter, when it was less likely to suck up sea turtles as they approach our beaches to nest, and less likely to harm fish during their biologically active times. But in 2021, however, the Corps abandoned that seasonal restriction, claiming that the big companies needed more flexibility on when they could dredge, despite the fact that they had been able to dredge for decades in the winter season. So SCLC represented Cape Fear River Watch and a couple other environmental nonprofit groups in a lawsuit challenging the Corps' decision to remove that seasonal restriction. And we raised some of these concerns that folks had here of impacts to fish as well as impacts to endangered species. And we won. So now the Corps, that makes me feel good, thanks y'all. And so now the Corps has to go back to the drawing board if it wants to, and it has to redo that environmental analysis if it wants to change the time of year in which it's able to do that hopper dredging. And so you might be asking why all of that matters in the context of the proposed expansion. We know that with a bigger harbor comes with more erosion and consequently more frequent and more extensive maintenance dredging. And we know that we already have to dredge annually in order to maintain what we have today. Additionally, we know that private national companies are demanding more flexibility on the time of year that they can dredge, and the Corps is trying to shift to this year-round approach. So the big takeaway here is that before we move forward on a massive project like this, we need to consider the ongoing environmental costs of maintaining it. We need to consider the environmental resources, like our economically and recreational important fisheries and our threatened and endangered sea turtles that we're putting at risk in doing this. So thus far, we've discussed impacts to our natural resources, but I do want to spend some time talking about possible impacts to our community too. We know that the purpose of this proposed expansion is to bring in bigger ships, and with bigger ships comes more cargo. And with that, all of that cargo is going to need somewhere to go. So it's possible that as a result of this proposal, we'll see increased hauls and increased on-land vehicle traffic and associated air and noise pollution. It's also possible that we could see increased on-land development as a result of this project. Now, past studies that looked at this proposal didn't go into complex detail in terms of what actually could happen in terms of the induced growth, but we've seen this play out in our neighboring states. In Savannah Harbor, for example, we've seen massive industrial parks and container warehouses go up following port expansions. So this map is a map of Savannah Harbor, and it shows different warehouses that were built, and they're color-coded based on the time of year. So the darker the block, the more recent it was developed. And between 2019 and 2022, just 3 years, 77 different warehouses were built in the area surrounding the expanded port. It's also possible that along with an increased rate of this coming in, the size could be increasing of these warehouses too. More than half of the largest warehouses were built within the past 4 years. So the increase in rate and the scope of the size could be increasing with the size of the port as well. So as a result of this induced development, the Georgia side of Savannah Harbor, which is the side with all those warehouses colored in, is now primarily industrial warehousing space. Now, Savannah's kind of unique. It's got a Georgia side and a South Carolina side, and unfortunately, we're seeing that same induced industrial growth happen on the South Carolina side of things too. More and more industrial development is coming to this area, and they're citing the expanded port as the reason for locating there. And these large industrial spaces have environmental impacts of their own. Often you have to fill wetlands, tear down trees, displace wildlife in order to build these big industrial spaces. And for communities, they add to the increase of on-land air and noise pollution that I mentioned, and they also create a lot of hard surfaces in coastal areas, which can increase our flooding that we already see here today. So again, this is where I back out and talk about some challenges that we're already facing. Wilmington is already growing at a crazy pace. And so all of these induced growth questions raise a lot of siting concerns. Where will this new growth go? And who does it displace? As we've seen across the country, massive industrial projects like this are most often cited in communities of color and communities of low income. So we need to thoughtfully and carefully consider which of our communities here are going to bear the biggest burden of this increased industrialized development, as well as the burden of any sort of increased on-land traffic and that noise and air pollution that I mentioned. We need to consider whether this increased cargo import will incentivize any other growth and where it would be sited in this area. And we really need to look at the city as a whole and evaluate whether the indirect impacts of expanding the port, those impacts on traffic, noise, and community displacement, are feasible and worth any possible gains that we could get from this project. So now that we've talked about changing water, changing sand, and changing community, I'm going to ask you to bear with me and back out one more time. And this time we need to look outside of Wilmington, not just focus on the city, but we need to look across our entire Southeast. And across the coastal Southeast, we've seen near continuous pressure to constantly expand and expand and expand our harbors. And we're seeing this as our ports try to compete with one another. In Savannah and Charleston, they most recently completed deepenings, and there's already rumblings about when that will be deepened again. And we've seen that continuous pressure to expand here too. The Wilmington Turning Basin project was just completed in 2020, and we're already back here today talking about making the harbor even bigger. All of this continuous deepening, again, is being taken as ports try to compete with one another. And at some point, we need to pause in that competition, and we need to ask ourselves, do we truly need a deep water port at every harbor along the Southeast? It's a tough question. And now is really the time to start thinking through questions like that and to think through the impacts that come with any sort of answer, no matter which side it is. You, as residents and experts of the Cape Fear, have the knowledge and the relevant expertise that our state and our federal agencies need as they think through those tough questions too. And like I mentioned, now is the time in which we need to be doing that. So like I said at the beginning, the Army Corps has to undergo an environmental analysis if it wants to proceed with this project. And that environmental analysis began just this past Tuesday. The Army Corps has announced that it is opening up a public comment period in which it wants members of the public, like you and like me, to tell the Corps what it should be focusing on as it undergoes this environmental review. This is a public comment process that is open to anybody, and you don't have to have any sort of expertise in order to get involved. And they're really just asking what y'all are concerned about and what you think the agency should know. So that comment process opens and runs until June 30th. And the Corps is also hosting a public information session down here in Cape Fear, just a couple blocks over. And you can find more information at the website that's linked on the presentation below. So as I close, I want to mention that this conversation, we've talked about this changing water, changing sand, and changing community. But these are just a couple of the environmental impacts that could happen with this project. And so given the full scope and everything that we know that could come, I want to leave you with a quick thought. We don't have to continue down the path of deepening and deepening and deepening because that's what we've always done. We have a truly unique opportunity here to stop and to think and to look at what our neighbors have done in other states and to look at what's already happening here in Wilmington and to think through all of that that's happening and to channel it into really creative solutions. Wilmington is facing some really tough challenges, but Wilmington is also posed in a unique space where it can set an example of how resilient communities tackle massive issues, particularly in the face of climate change and all of the other changes that we discussed. So I encourage you all, again, as residents and as experts on the Cape Fear, to really think through those challenges and to engage in the public comment process. And if you have any questions about that process or about any of these likely impacts, I'm happy to answer them, but you can also come and find me later. Thank you. Do you want to do questions? Sure, it's totally up to you.
Does anybody have any questions? Just raise your hand. We'll bring a mic over.
Okay, awesome. Oh, okay, I'll stay here.
Hey, my name is David Joyner. I'm an assistant district attorney here in Wilmington, North Carolina. I'm just curious if you could talk to us a little bit about how organizations like Cape Fear River Watch have standing to bring these lawsuits. what does it take to raise your hand and say, I'm harmed by this action and I want to be a part of this case?
Sure. So do you mean in terms of this project or just any environmental lawsuit? Because
More-
this isn't technically a lawsuit yet.
More so with the work that you do when you're
Yeah.
filing these actions.
Sure. So in order to bring standing in either state or federal court, you have to show that you are harmed in some way. And so environmental organizations, we know that like these big issues that are facing our community cause a bunch of different types of harm. Harm can show up in terms of changing the way that you get to use your land or changing the way that you get to paddle down the Cape Fear. Harm can come from increased pollution in your water, and it can come from increased fear of not being able to catch the fish that you used to be able to catch. We also know that harm can look like economic harm. It can look like health harm, but it doesn't have to necessarily arise to that level. And so on the cases that I've worked on, for instance, that dredging case that I mentioned, we were able to show the court that the Army Corps' decision of dredging during the summer and threatening those fish and those sea turtles causes real harm to the folks who not only value that wildlife, but also spend a lot of time on the Cape Fear and enjoy seeing it, enjoy fishing, enjoy eating the fish that they catch, and enjoy showing it to other folks. So those types of things are the things that we'll point out as harm. And yeah, that's what we have to do to get into court. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
Okay, we have another question over here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Roger Shue, Riverwatch, and UNCW. I just wanted to ask a question. Assuming the debt reduction bill is passed, one of the things within there is about NEPA and the reduction in time allowed for the process to go for looking at environmental impact statements. For instance, reducing that comment period to about 2 years instead. So what are your thoughts on that relative to processes and projects that are now and currently or coming down the pike?
I knew someone would ask about the debt reduction bill. All right, so with NEPA, yeah, we've seen, unfortunately, over the past couple of years, a lot of changes to NEPA, and a lot of those changes have been rolling back opportunities for the public to get engaged. And we think that's really harmful because one of the core values of NEPA is so that members of the public and members of the scientific community can tell our state and federal agencies what they need to know. And so in terms of this project, the Corps has committed to spending the next 4 years studying it. And the way that they're doing this is they're opening a pre-scoping period, and that's the period that just kicked off this past Tuesday. And during this period, they're just asking us for general input, and then they will start the formal NEPA process down the line. So there will be other opportunities for public comment later on. And the website that I had linked, let's see, there gives you a detail of the different timeline of all of those public comment opportunities. But it's just simply infeasible to study massive projects like this on such a condensed timeline. So it's possible we might see things like this in the future if federal agencies are willing to comprehensively study projects. Unfortunately, cuts to NEPA could also mean that some of the environmental reviews that we need and that we rely on could be shortcutted, and that can be really harmful to the project itself and to obviously the community that's experiencing impacts. Does that kind of answer your question? Awesome. Yeah.
Ask other questions. So, yeah, you raise your hand. Cool.
Okay. Hi. You mentioned that looking further down, further south, there were others who were already doing this, and you talked about communities being displaced.
Sure.
What do you see, and what do you need in terms of that?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that comes with just increased industrial development in general is that communities are displaced as these big companies come in, buy up land that's relatively cheap. In the Savannah situation that I mentioned, a lot of that land is rural, and so we're seeing more of environmental destruction. A lot of the things that we've been mapping our filling of wetlands and stuff like that. But on the South Carolina side, we do have some of these community impacts as well. And so it's hard to predict exactly what it's going to look like, particularly here, because we're in a very different space than some of our other harbors across the Southeast. And like I said, the folks who have done any sort of environmental review on this really haven't looked at where the possible induced growth could be. And so what we've been trying to play out is just try to identify our at-risk communities, and with the knowledge that this country has been founded on environmental injustice, and a lot of our communities have had to bear the burden of this pollution for far longer than they should. And so we're trying to identify at-risk communities and just raise that concern early on, so that not only are agencies paying attention to the fact that those communities are here, but so that they can take into consideration what that induced growth could look like. So unfortunately, I don't have specifics of what it could play out here, but it's just something that, especially as this review gets going, we just need to be really conscious of.
Okay, we have one hand, and that's going to be the last one, so we can move on. I'm bringing you the mic.
There's a recent Supreme Court decision where they redefined water in the context of wetlands, and it makes it much more difficult to protect wetlands. And I'm wondering how that's going to affect your mission here.
Y'all brought up two of the hardest things to talk about. Yes, so there was a recent Supreme Court decision, and it significantly rolled back Clean Water Act protection for a lot of our wetlands, and consequently a lot of our waterways, because we know our wetlands are really important for filtering out both pollution that's coming into our waterways, and it's also really important for us in terms of coastal flooding that we see here. And so it's possible that it can impact projects like this, where certain wetlands that would be impacted could no longer fall within that definition. Here, the vast majority of the wetland impacts that we're concerned about are upstream. They're not the ones that are going to be filled by any sort of material that would require some sort of permit, but we do want to be conscious of those upstream wetlands. Other projects with this decision, it completely removes Clean Water Act protection for those wetlands. And so I can say that we'll have to get creative in the ways that we want to protect our wetlands. I think there are legal avenues for us to do so. But unfortunately, environmental law is at a fun little crossroads here, where we are seeing rollbacks of our foundational environmental laws that could have drastic impacts on those specific wetlands that are no longer protected, but also are downstream in our communities nearby. So if you have creative solutions, I'd love to hear them, and just know that we're thinking about them too.